On June 21st, 2026, Jordan Peterson posted a video to the more than 8 million people who follow him. Not to debate, not to lecture, but to admit something almost unthinkable for a man who built an empire on his own voice. "I'm pleased to let you know that we're going to release a lecture a week from my extensive tour archive," he revealed, beginning this Sunday and then repeating every Sunday after that. Then came the line that mattered most. "This allows me to do something interesting and useful while I'm otherwise incapacitated." Incapacitated. The word landed like a verdict. A man once heard live in sold-out arenas across 5 continents was reduced to reposting old footage because he could no longer create anything new. To understand why a single word could carry that much weight, you have to remember who Jordan Peterson actually became. A clinical psychologist with a doctorate from McGill University, a lecturer at Harvard before he came home to Canada, the author of 12 Rules for Life, a book that sold millions of copies and turned a university lecture hall into a worldwide movement. A man whose YouTube channel alone draws more than 8 million subscribers, whose voice filled arenas in Sydney, London, and Los Angeles, and whose name became shorthand for an entire era of cultural argument. But behind that towering reputation lies a story not triumphant, but devastating. 7 years of a body and a mind quietly failing behind the curtain of public confidence. A dependency on medication that nearly cost him his life once already. A mold-poisoned house that nearly finished what the medication started. Weeks fighting for breath in intensive care. And a nerve condition so punishing that even now, his own wife admits his mornings are close to unbearable. So what does it take to bring down a man who spent his entire career teaching the world how to survive suffering? Jordan Peterson told millions of people to carry their pain with meaning. Now he is the one carrying the pain, and even he admits he has not yet found the meaning in it. If Jordan Peterson's words ever helped you stand up straight on a day you did not think you could, hit like right now as a tribute to the man who taught a generation to face the dragon. Even now that the dragon has turned out to live inside his own body. It is a quiet kind of tragedy when a legend's silence is caused not by having nothing left to say, but by a body that will no longer let him say it. To understand how Jordan Peterson got here, we have to go back to the moment a quiet Canadian psychology professor became one of the most listened-to men on Earth. Jordan Burnt Peterson was born on June 12, 1962, in Edmonton, Alberta, a city better known for cold winters than world-famous thinkers. He earned his doctorate in clinical psychology from McGill University in 1991, then taught at Harvard from 1993 to 1998, before coming home to Canada to join the faculty at the University of Toronto. For most of that career, he was exactly what the title suggests: a respected academic, not a household name. That changed in 2016. When the Canadian government moved to mandate the use of compelled pronouns under Bill C-16, Peterson recorded a video refusing to comply, and the clip meant for a handful of students reached millions instead. Donations on his Patreon page climbed from roughly $1,000 a month in August of that year to more than $80,000 a month by May 2018. The professor had become a movement. Then came the book. 12 Rules for Life, published in January 2018, sold millions of copies worldwide and carried Peterson on a sold-out lecture tour that filled arenas across 5 continents, the very tour whose archive he would, 8 years later, find himself reduced to recycling from a sickbed. He followed it in 2021 with Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, by which point he had stepped away from his professorship at Toronto to focus on writing and podcasting full-time. In 2022, he became Chancellor of Ralston College in Savannah, Georgia, In 2024, he published We Who Wrestle with God and co-founded the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, a network aimed at shaping policy debates across the Western world. Through all of it, the through line never changed. Peterson built an entire intellectual career on one central argument: that suffering is inevitable, but how a person carries it is a choice. He said it to lecture halls. He said it to arenas. He said it to a YouTube audience that would eventually top 8 million subscribers. And to a wife, Tammy Roberts, he had married back in 1989, and to 2 children, Michaela and Julian, who grew up watching their father become one of the most listened-to men on the planet. It was a strange kind of foreshadowing that a man who spent 3 decades teaching the world how to answer suffering would, soon enough, have to answer it not as a professor lecturing from a podium, but as a patient lying in a hospital bed of his own. In the spring of 2019, Tammy Peterson was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of kidney cancer called Bellini duct carcinoma, a disease so uncommon that few oncologists in North America had ever managed a case of it. The prognosis was grim. Jordan Peterson, who had built a career telling millions of strangers how to carry unbearable weight, was suddenly facing the prospect of losing his wife of 3 decades. And there was nothing in any of his 12 rules that could make that fear smaller. To manage the anxiety of that period, Peterson had for several years been taking a low dose of a benzodiazepine, a class of anti-anxiety medication that is generally considered safe in small, short-term doses. As Tammy's diagnosis deepened the strain on the household, his dose was increased in 2019, and what had been a manageable prescription quietly hardened into a severe physical dependency. From the outside, almost nobody noticed. Peterson kept writing, kept appearing on stages, kept giving interviews. Inside, his body was already losing the fight. Then came the part of the story he would not be able to walk away from quietly. When he attempted to come off the medication, his nervous system reacted with a condition called akathisia, a reaction marked by relentless, full-body restlessness. People who develop severe akathisia describe being unable to sit, unable to lie still, unable to find a single position anywhere in a room that brings even a minute of relief, for hours at a stretch, day after day. For a man whose entire public identity rested on discipline, order, and self-mastery, it was a uniquely cruel form of unraveling, a condition that made stillness itself, the most basic act of self-control there is, physically impossible. Tammy's cancer, against odds the family had been told to expect the worst from, went into remission, a recovery she would later call nothing short of a miracle. One, she said, left her so certain she had witnessed something sacred that she converted to Catholicism not long afterward. But while his wife's body was healing, Jordan's was falling apart. The family made the difficult decision to seek treatment outside Canada, first in Russia and then in Serbia, chasing specialists willing to manage a withdrawal this severe. At one point, doctors placed him in a medically induced coma, a last resort measure meant to give his nervous system a chance to reset while fully sedated. It was his daughter, Michaela Peterson, who first stepped forward publicly to explain to a worried audience what the family was actually going through, becoming, almost by accident, the family's spokesperson for a crisis no one had a script for. It was a role she would find herself playing again, years later, when an entirely different illness forced her to pick up that same responsibility once more. As if the dependency crisis were not enough, 2020 brought its own assault. Peterson contracted COVID-19 not once, but twice that year, each infection landing on lungs already weakened by months of medical treatment. And at one point the illness developed into full pneumonia. By the time he was well enough to give a substantial public interview again in early 2021, longtime followers barely recognized him. Visibly thinner, audibly slower, a long way from the commanding lecturer who had filled arenas just 3 years before. It was a bitter twist for a man whose entire philosophy rested on the claim that suffering could be met with order and responsibility. To spend 2 straight years trapped inside a kind of chaos that no amount of discipline could simply will away. He would recover, at least publicly. But the body, it turned out, kept its own records, written in a language no lecture could override, and in the years ahead, those records would come due again, in a form no one in the family was prepared for. By the summer of 2025, longtime followers had begun to notice something was wrong. Public appearances grew rarer. Podcast episodes slowed to a trickle. Tour dates across Europe quietly disappeared from his website, with no real explanation attached. Michaela later described her father, in the months leading up to that summer, as uncharacteristically worn down, prone to sudden exhaustion and unexplained tearfulness that the family now understands was driven by physical pain rather than anything emotional. For a man whose entire brand was built on relentless output, the silence itself was the loudest signal something had changed. The explanation, when it finally came, took almost everyone by surprise. In August 2025, Tammy Peterson posted directly to her father's millions of followers with a diagnosis few outside specialized medical circles had ever heard of: chronic inflammatory response syndrome, known to the doctors who treat it as CIRS. The trigger, she explained, had been mold exposure while the family was clearing out a deceased relative's house, a home that turned out to be saturated with the kind of biotoxins that roughly 1 in 4 people carry a genetic inability to clear from their own bodies. Specialists in the field rely on genetic markers, blood panels, and exposure history to build a diagnosis, since there is no single definitive test. For someone with the relevant genetic vulnerability, exposure to a contaminated building does not cause a cold or a rash. It floods the immune system into a state of chronic, multi-system inflammation that can affect the lungs, the joints, the nervous system, and the gut all at once. Michaela was careful to draw a hard line for her father's audience. To be crystal clear, she wrote, "This isn't about akathisia or medication. He's not on any medication. It's an immune system dysfunction." It was an important distinction at the time, separating this new emergency from the benzodiazepine crisis that had nearly broken the family 5 years earlier. But in hindsight, that line would prove far harder to hold than anyone in the family could have known in August of 2025. What made the diagnosis especially painful, and in its own way oddly comforting, was the realization that it explained years of suffering that had never made sense before. Michaela revealed that her father had quietly battled severe, unexplained allergies and food sensitivities since around 2017, with doctors unable to pin down a cause for any of it. The strict, almost entirely carnivorous diet Peterson had adopted years earlier, originally inspired by Michaela's own recovery from juvenile arthritis, had functioned as an accidental form of damage control all along. Eating meat and little else had kept his undiagnosed immune dysfunction from spiraling out of control for years. By the summer of 2025, even that diet was no longer enough. Michaela wrote that the family was thanking God they finally had a name for what had been hurting him for so long. A small mercy in the middle of a frightening summer. Mainstream medicine remains divided on CIRS as a diagnosis. Some physicians treat it as an established, if underrecognized, multi-system illness. Others argue the science behind it has not yet met the bar for broad clinical acceptance. The Peterson family did not wait for that debate to settle. They pursued treatment aimed at removing Jordan from any environment that might contain biotoxins, using binding agents intended to help his body excrete what it could not clear on its own, alongside anti-inflammatory protocols meant to calm a system that had been quietly in crisis for years without a name. Michaela described her father as responding well in the earliest days of treatment, even as she admitted the process itself was pretty rough. The podcast went on indefinite pause. The European tour dates were formally postponed. For the moment, the family allowed themselves something close to relief. After years of mystery, they finally knew what they were fighting. And there was, for the first time in a long time, a treatment plan instead of a question mark. But how do you treat an illness that has already been quietly eating away at someone for the better part of a decade? Within weeks, the answer arrived in the worst possible way, when the same immune crisis that had been framed as treatable and survivable tipped suddenly into something the family had no way of preparing for. The relief the Peterson family allowed themselves in August did not survive the month. Within weeks of the CIRS diagnosis, the same compromised immune system that doctors had hoped to slowly stabilize through treatment instead spiraled in the opposite direction. Peterson developed pneumonia while undergoing care in Switzerland. And pneumonia, in a body already weakened by years of undiagnosed inflammatory illness, did not stay contained. It progressed into sepsis, a bloodstream infection capable of shutting down organs one by one if it is not caught in time, and one of the leading causes of death inside intensive care units worldwide. It was caught, but only barely. Peterson was admitted to intensive care, and what followed was nearly a month inside a unit most people only ever picture from the outside. Ventilators and monitors tracking every breath and heartbeat. A body too compromised to be left unwatched for even a few hours, and a family kept largely at a distance by hospital protocol during the single most dangerous stretch of his life. For days at a time, the people who loved him most could do little but wait outside a closed door for updates that did not always bring good news, and sometimes brought none at all. Tammy Peterson, who had leaned on her Catholic faith ever since her own cancer recovery 6 years earlier, later said, the family turned to prayer almost constantly during that month. Treating each day, Jordan remained alive, as its own small answer to a question none of them dared to ask out loud. There was little else to do. Modern medicine had already done what it could. Survival, at that point, was largely a matter of waiting to see whether his body would hold. It was, once again, Michaela Peterson who stepped forward to tell the world what had happened, just as she had during the benzodiazepine crisis 5 years earlier. In a video posted to her own channel, she described the preceding months in 3 words that needed no embellishment: exceedingly difficult. She confirmed what insiders had already suspected, but the public did not yet know, that her father had spent weeks in intensive care, and that for a stretch of that stay, doctors and family alike genuinely believed they might lose him. Near death. It was the same daughter, carrying the same instinct to step into the spotlight her father had spent his career standing in, only this time delivering news instead of theory, grief instead of argument. Peterson survived the sepsis, but survival, in cases this severe, rarely arrives without a toll of its own. Weeks confined to an intensive care bed, sedated and immobile, had triggered a condition called critical illness polyneuropathy, nerve damage that develops in patients who spend extended periods critically ill and motionless. In practical terms, it meant that a man who had walked across stages on every continent for the better part of a decade now had to relearn, almost from nothing, how to use muscles that had simply forgotten what they were for. Physical therapists worked with him on tasks most adults never think twice about. Standing without support, taking a single step, holding a cup steady enough to drink from it. The body that had carried him through sold-out arenas could no longer reliably carry him across a hospital room. By October 2025, he was finally out of intensive care, transferred to a step-down unit for patients well enough to leave critical monitoring, but nowhere near well enough to go home. He would remain hospitalized for 2 more months, undergoing additional treatment, including surgery, before doctors finally cleared him to return home in December. 4 months had passed between the CIRS diagnosis that briefly felt like an answer and the day he was finally well enough to walk, however unsteadily, back through his own front door, supported by family on either side. The news did not stay private for long. By the time he was discharged, outlets that had spent years covering Peterson's lectures and his arguments were now covering his survival instead, describing a man once seen exclusively behind a podium now photographed, when photographed at all, in the muted light of a recovery room. There is a particular cruelty in surviving the worst of an illness, only to discover that surviving was not, in fact, the hard part. Peterson came home in December 2025 alive, which by any measure was the outcome his family had prayed for through the darkest weeks of that fall. But alive and recovered are not the same word, and in the months that followed, the family would slowly come to understand that what had nearly killed him in that Swiss hospital was only one layer of a problem that ran far deeper than any single infection. Something older than the mold, older even than the sepsis, was still quietly unfinished inside him, something the family had once believed they had already left behind for good. In April 2026, 4 months after Jordan Peterson had finally made it home from the hospital in Switzerland, his daughter posted another video, and this one reframed everything the family had told the public up to that point. The CIRS diagnosis, the mold exposure, the months in intensive care, all of it, Michaela explained, had not been a separate emergency layered on top of an old, resolved injury. It was the same injury, returning. Her father, she revealed, was suffering from what doctors call Tardive akathisia, the same neurological condition that had nearly destroyed him during his benzodiazepine withdrawal back in 2019 and 2020, and it had never actually gone away. It had simply gone quiet for a few years, before stress and illness combined to wake it back up. Tardive akathisia is a movement disorder that can follow the use, or the discontinuation, of certain psychiatric medications, and unlike most drug side effects, it does not necessarily end when the medication does. According to data published by the National Institutes of Health, cases of akathisia that last longer than 6 months are considered rare. Jordan Peterson's case, by the spring of 2026, had lasted 6 years, a span so far outside the normal range that doctors who treat the condition have very little precedent to draw on when families ask how much longer it might last. The condition does not arrive as a single symptom. It arrives as a collection of smaller ones, each with its own way of wearing a person down. There is the restlessness itself, a constant pressure to shift position, to stand, to pace, that can make sitting through a meal or a meeting feel like an act of physical endurance. There is the toll on concentration, since a mind occupied with managing a body that will not settle has little bandwidth left for sustained thought, the kind of thought Peterson had once produced for hours at a stretch in front of a camera. There is the social cost, the way a simple conversation, once his most natural setting, becomes a negotiation between wanting to engage and a body actively working against him the entire time. And there is the practical cost layered on top of all of it. No new podcast episodes, no new lectures, no new chapters, because the condition that makes stillness impossible also makes the sustained focus required to create anything close to impossible as well. Doctors have tried to manage the symptoms with low doses of certain antipsychotic medications or with propranolol, a heart medication sometimes repurposed to calm the nervous system. But both options carry their own risks, and neither offers anything close to a guaranteed fix. Michaela did not soften the description for her father's audience. She called the condition devastating, and explained that it is frequently misdiagnosed as ordinary anxiety, since the symptoms can look, from the outside, like simple nervousness. In reality, doctors who specialize in the condition describe something closer to a body that has lost the ability to be still. Patients report an unrelenting urge to move that never fully resolves, shifting in a chair every few seconds, pacing a room without meaning to, an inner restlessness so constant that ordinary tasks like reading, writing, or sitting through a conversation become exhausting in a way few people without the condition can fully picture. Research into the condition remains limited, Michaela noted, and treatment options are narrow, in part because the pharmaceutical industry has little incentive to fund studies into a condition caused by its own products. Michaela attributed the recent flare-up to a convergence of stressors that would have tested anyone, let alone a body already this fragile. Within a short span of time, both of Jordan's parents had passed away, and the family had relocated permanently from Canada to the United States, on top of the lingering aftershocks of the mold exposure and the CIRS diagnosis still working their way through his system. Grief, upheaval, and unresolved illness had arrived together, and his nervous system, already operating without much reserve, had nowhere left to absorb the impact. Jonathan Pajot, a longtime friend of the family, gave the most granular public account of what daily life actually looked like. He described Peterson as overwhelmed with pain and discomfort after even brief conversations, the kind of exchange that would have been effortless for him a decade earlier. On Peterson's better days, Pajot recalled, he was capable of taking a short walk, working briefly on a project, or holding a real conversation, always with visible difficulty and never for long. On the bad days, the restlessness simply did not let up, making it nearly impossible to focus on anything at all. There is something almost unbearably literal about a condition like Tardive akathisia attaching itself to a man like Jordan Peterson. Here was someone who had spent 3 decades telling people that discipline, structure, and the deliberate ordering of one's own behavior were the tools that made a meaningful life possible. Akathisia takes that exact toolkit and renders it useless. It cannot be disciplined away. It does not respond to willpower, structure, or argument. The 3 things Peterson had spent his entire public life insisting were enough to face almost anything. For 6 years, his own body had been arguing back, in a language that did not care how many books he had written about suffering. What the public did not yet know, in April of 2026, was just how directly Peterson's own wife would soon describe that suffering, in words that would leave little room for interpretation. For nearly a year, almost everything the public had learned about Jordan Peterson's health had arrived secondhand, filtered through his daughter's social media posts and brief family statements. That changed in early May 2026, when Tammy Peterson sat down for an interview with the New York Post and, for the first time, described her husband's condition directly, at length, and without the protective distance of a video script. What she said was, by any measure, the most detailed and unguarded account the family had ever given, and unlike the short social media posts that had carried the story so far, an interview with a major outlet meant the words would be read, quoted, and circulated in a way a single video never could be. Within hours, outlets far beyond the Post were running the same lines, and fans who had spent years absorbing his philosophy in their own lives were now absorbing, for the first time, the full weight of what that philosophy was currently being asked to withstand. Dr. Peterson is at home with family and helpful companions, Tammy told the Post. He is not talking about going back to work yet. The setting itself said something. This was not a man recovering in a hospital or pursuing one more experimental treatment abroad. He was simply home, in Arizona, surrounded by people, with no timeline for anything beyond the day in front of him. Tammy added that he feels as if he's in another realm of pain, a phrase that would end up quoted, requoted, and shared across the internet by fans who had spent years learning their own vocabulary for suffering directly from him. In the same conversation, Tammy put a precise clinical name to what her husband was living through. He had developed, she explained, a chronic movement disorder characterized by intense restlessness and a compulsive need to move, a known consequence of stopping certain psychiatric medications. It was the most direct, least hedged confirmation the family had given, removing any remaining ambiguity about what exactly was happening inside her husband's body. Then came the sentence that would become the defining image of the entire ordeal. "His mornings are brutally painful and discouraging for him," she said. Later, much later in the day, he sometimes feels some relief. It is a strange kind of structure to live inside, a day built backward from pain instead of forward toward purpose, where the best a person can hope for is that, hours from now, some of it might lift. For a man who had spent his career telling audiences to get up, make their bed, and impose order on their immediate surroundings before anything else, mornings had become the single hardest part of being alive. Tammy traced the root of the condition directly back to the benzodiazepine he had been prescribed years earlier, the same medication that had triggered the original crisis in 2019. The damage done from psych medications from over 6 years ago, she said, takes patience, time, and loving attention. It was a quiet but pointed reframing. This was not a new disaster. It was an old one, finally being named in full, in the plainest language the family had ever used in public. She did not stop at describing his suffering. Tammy used the interview to make a broader point about the medication that had caused it. There are many testimonials written by people who have suffered from psych medication damage, she told the Post, adding that the medical industry will have to face this evidence and take steps to protect the public from harm. It was the first time the family had framed Jordan's ordeal not only as a personal tragedy, but as a cautionary tale with implications well beyond their own household. A warning aimed at the millions of people prescribed similar medications every year who had never been told what withdrawal, done wrong, could cost them. Perhaps the most quietly devastating detail in the entire interview had nothing to do with pain at all. Asked about what her husband missed most, Tammy did not mention the lecture halls, the book tours, or the spotlight. He misses the opportunity to weigh in on societal issues, she said. Of everything fame had given Jordan Peterson, arenas, royalties, a global platform, what he wanted back was simply the conversation itself, the ability to argue, debate, and be heard on the things he cared about. A man who had built an empire on having something to say was now defined, more than anything else, by the things he could no longer say. The interview confirmed what close observers had long suspected, and what the family had now stated outright. There was no return date. Tammy offered no timetable for podcasting, no projected month for a comeback tour, no promise that the version of Jordan Peterson the public remembered would ever fully reappear. For an audience of millions who had built parts of their own lives around his advice, that absence of an answer was, in its own way, harder to sit with than almost anything else the family had revealed. The reaction online looked nothing like the usual response to a Jordan Peterson headline. For a decade, his name had reliably triggered argument, agreement, and everything in between. This time, comment sections filled instead with something closer to a vigil. Strangers who had never met him thanking him for ideas that had changed how they lived. Well wishes for a recovery nobody could promise, and a kind of collective concern usually reserved for a public figure's family rather than the public figure himself. For a man who had spent years at the center of arguments, it was, perhaps for the first time, the sound of an audience simply hoping, together for the same thing? And yet, even inside that uncertainty, something had not gone quiet. The man at the center of the story had not stopped thinking about the people on the other side of the camera, even from a recovery room in Arizona, where most days began in pain and offered only a few hours of relief if he was lucky. So what does a man do when the work he built his entire identity around has become physically impossible, but the instinct to reach his audience has not gone anywhere at all? The answer arrived on a Sunday. On June 21, 2026, Jordan Peterson posted a short video to the millions of people still waiting for some sign of him. And it was, in its own quiet way, the closest thing to good news the story had offered in nearly a year. He was not returning to the podcast. He was not announcing a tour. What he announced instead was smaller, and in some ways more telling. A lecture a week, pulled from the archive of his Old World Tour, released every Sunday for as long as the archive held material to release. "This allows me to do something interesting and useful," he said, "while I'm otherwise incapacitated." He added that he was glad, given the state of his health, simply to be able to take part in something again, even in this reduced form. It was not the comeback his followers had spent a year hoping for. It was something closer to a compromise between a man whose body would not yet let him create and a man who could not stand the idea of disappearing entirely. There was something almost symbolic in the choice to reach back into the tour archive specifically. That archive held years of recorded material covering nearly everything Peterson had ever lectured on in front of a live audience: psychology, mythology, religious texts, and the political debates that had made his name a household word. Recorded during the very tour that had carried him to arenas on 5 continents at the height of his fame. It was that same footage he was now, 8 years later, recycling from a recovery room because his own body would no longer cooperate with anything new. Friends close to the project described it as a deliberate return to his roots, a structure closer to the simple lecture videos that had first built his YouTube audience years before. 12 Rules for Life turned him into a global phenomenon. Not a comeback, but a kind of homecoming. He confirmed what the family had already made clear in May. Podcasting and live, in-person lectures remained out of reach for now, with no projected date for either. The European tour, including previously announced dates at arenas in Berlin and Leeds, stayed cancelled, the recovery still too slow and far too uncertain to promise an audience anything in advance. He gave no estimate for when, or even whether, that would eventually change. Other parts of the operation Peterson had built, however, had not stopped while he recovered. Peterson Academy, the online education platform he had founded as an alternative to traditional university courses, continued operating under his daughter's management, offering self-paced lessons in psychology, philosophy, and personal development, built largely on the framework he had spent decades developing. The Jordan B. Peterson podcast itself kept releasing new episodes as well, hosted by guests and occasional co-hosts, even as the man whose name was on the marquee remained almost entirely absent from the recording booth. The institutions he had spent years building were, in their own limited way, keeping the lights on, even while their founder could not yet walk back through the door himself. For a man whose entire identity, for nearly 30 years, had been built on the act of speaking directly to an audience, live and unscripted, the decision to lean on archived material instead carried its own kind of honesty. He was not pretending to be recovered. He was not performing wellness he did not feel. He was simply finding the smallest available version of the thing he had always done, and doing that instead of nothing. Reaction to the announcement, much like the reaction to Tammy's interview a month earlier, leaned overwhelmingly toward relief rather than disappointment. Followers who had spent a year wondering whether they would ever hear from him again, and who had watched months of speculation and rumor fill the silence in his absence, treated a once-a-week recycled lecture less like a consolation prize and more like proof of life. For an audience that had absorbed his message about finding the smallest meaningful task available when the larger ones are out of reach, watching him apply that exact principle to his own collapse landed as something close to validation. The man who had told them to find one small, manageable thing to do, even in chaos, had just shown them, in real time, what doing that actually looks like. It would be the most public Jordan Peterson had been in nearly a year, and it would still leave the one question that mattered most completely unanswered. Not whether he could find a small way forward, but whether the man behind 8 million subscribers, sold-out arenas, and 3 decades of argument would ever fully get his life back at all. Whatever happens next, the numbers tell only part of the story, and they are not the part that matters most. 8 million YouTube subscribers, 12 Rules for Life and its sequel, sold in the millions worldwide. A movement that reshaped how an entire generation argued about responsibility, meaning, and order. None of that has gone anywhere. Jordan Peterson's legacy, built across 3 decades of lecture halls, books, and arenas, remains exactly as large as it was the day before any of this began. What has changed is what he can personally add to it, at least for now. And in a strange way, that pause may end up teaching people something his books never quite could. For years, Peterson told audiences, in the abstract, that suffering was inevitable and meaning had to be built inside it anyway. What his family has shared since 2025, the dependency, the mold exposure, the sepsis, the 6 years of a body that will not sit still, has turned that abstract argument into something audiences can actually watch happen to a real person in real time. Tammy's plea for the medical industry to take psychiatric medication withdrawal seriously may end up protecting people who have never read a single one of his books and never will. He had spent his career arguing that a meaningful life comes from finding the largest burden a person can carry, and carrying it anyway. He could not have known, writing that one day his own body would hand him a burden heavier than any audience he ever addressed, with no guarantee of the kind of ending he used to promise everyone else. Watching the family close ranks around him said almost as much about his legacy as any sales figure could. Tammy, whose own brush with cancer years earlier had reshaped her into a woman of unshakable faith, became the public voice willing to put a name to her husband's pain when he no longer could speak for himself. Michaela, who had first stepped into that exact role as a young woman trying to explain her father's benzodiazepine withdrawal to a worried internet, had now done it twice more, across 2 separate medical disasters, never once stepping back from the responsibility. Whatever else this ordeal had taken from Jordan Peterson, it had not taken the family that had assembled itself piece by piece around him. Even his absence had become its own kind of testimony. Commentators who once argued with him nightly admitted the public conversation felt thinner without him in it, a void filled, in his words' frequent absence, by voices with far less to say. A man cannot be that missed by people he has never met unless he genuinely changed something in how they lived. It is a quiet kind of tragedy when a man's silence is caused not by having nothing left to say, but by a body that will no longer let him say it. But silence, for now, is not the same as disappearance. Every Sunday, a little more of his voice returns to the people still listening for it. One old lecture at a time, proof that something of him is still, deliberately, choosing to be heard. If Jordan Peterson's words have ever helped you get through a morning you did not think you could get through, leave a tribute in the comments below for a man still fighting to get his voice back, one Sunday at a time. What is the one rule of his that has stayed with you the longest, through everything? And when his voice finally does come all the way back, will you be here for it? Hit subscribe now so you don't miss the day it happens.